A vast empire emanated from north-central Asia to cover the globe with its influence. Maybe you've heard of the Tartars? These are the heirs to the Tartarian Empire, or however you say it. This civilization's heartland was the now rugged terrain east of the Ural Mountains. Even hundreds or thousands of years ago, they had sophisticated technology and engineering projects. They were able to capture energy out of seemingly thin air, pulling electricity out of what is called the ether. They used this essentially unlimited power and know-how to conquer much of the world. And where they ruled, peace and prosperity followed. They erected beautiful, long-lasting buildings throughout their empire. And then catastrophe! The empire collapsed in a cataclysm called the Great Mud Flood, where many feet of mud spread to cover the world, burying the old order. This is often referred to as the Great Reset. Following this disaster, new powers rose, and jealous of the Tartarian Empire, they sought to systematically blot out the previous world order from history and memory. The First and Second World Wars were not, as we have been taught in school, land disputes at the height of global imperialism. No. They were the attempts of the new powers to destroy evidence of the Tartarian buildings through bombing campaigns designed to look like a war. Or maybe the erasure started with Napoleon. Regardless, the systematic blotting out of Tartaria is nearly complete. All that remains of the Tartarian Empire are surviving buildings scattered throughout the world. These buildings look out of place compared to the brutalist style of concrete and steel. They are almost all built of stone, with spires, which are really radio and energy receivers, columns, domes, and what would usually be called classical features. The U.S. Capitol, most state capitals, many banks and government buildings are really just repurposed Tartarian buildings.
Why do they want this to go away so much? Interesting thing about it, one of the symbols of that civilization, a symbol that was found all around the world in every single country, used by all cultures, even the Native American. Yeah. Interesting. That would be everywhere. That's a very, very ancient symbol. And even history is a lie. History is completely wrong. The whole Scaligerian concept of history that is promoted by the Vatican and promoted by mainstream academia is provably false. All of it. And the existence of Tartaria proves that. And just the fact that it's taken out of our history books. I mean,
today we're going to explore the idea that Solomon's Israel may have reached the entire globe, including the Americas, Far East Asia, and even Australia. Solomon was the first builder of what we call Tartarian architecture, but what is usually classified as Greco-Roman. Except this was a time before Greece and Rome. Traditional biblical chronology places Solomon's rule from 970 to 931 BC, and the first Greek city-states would not come to prominence for another 200 years. And yet the Temple of Solomon was said to have massive pillars with huge ceilings, intricate carvings of angels, lions, palm trees, and flowers, as well as archways, inner and outer courts, and hundreds of windows. 1 Kings 6 states, on the walls all around the temple in both the inner and outer rooms, he carved cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. He also covered the floors of both the inner and outer rooms of the temple with gold. And the temple and city were built on a hill surrounded by massive walls and huge bastions. We're told in the Bible that Solomon contracted the people of Tyre, the Phoenicians, to create this incredible structure, and that the Phoenician and Israelite navy would go on sea voyages for years at a time, returning with gold, spices, precious gemstones, and a special wood that has never been identified. 1 Kings 10:12 states, and the navy also of Hiram, Phoenicia, that brought gold from Ophir, brought in from Ophir great plenty of almug trees and precious stones. And the king made of the almug trees pillars of the house of the Lord, and for the king's house harps also, and psalteries for singers. There came no such almug trees, nor were seen unto this day. But where's the evidence of these sea voyages? If the ancient Israelites were really traveling the globe, wouldn't we have a record of this? The biblical text speaks of a far-off land called Ophir that took 3 years to travel by boat. And this was the land they got the vast amounts of gold for the building of the temple from. But no one has ever proven where this land was. This temple was the most significant palace in the era, and was what I like to call the first Tartarian building. But really it was said to be based off earlier Phoenician architecture, which originated from the Canaanites. These were the descendants of the people in the Levant, Syria and Turkey, who migrated to the region of Lebanon and Israel around 10,000 and 5,000 years ago. Oddly enough, the same region and time period that Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe were inhabited. Anyway, the Temple of Solomon could have been the original basis for what we call Greco-Roman or Tartarian architecture, and this could be why we see churches being built in this fashion all the way into the 20th century. And some say these buildings go back further than we're told, and were built on top of much older structures, possibly going as far back as this worldwide culture that Solomon ruled over.
And, and all the work that I'd done on history and all the research I'd done on history for years, I'd never considered the fact that the timeline was wrong, that the Dark Ages didn't exist. They just inserted 1,000 years and pushed everything back in time. And this was put out, the concept of this was put out by a guy called Anatoly Fomenko, who's a Russian guy, who said, yeah, look, they've added 1,000 years to history. And this was suggested by other people as well, such as Newton. All sorts of people suggested they added 1,000 years to history. When you start really looking into it, it's even worse than that. Like, history is completely fabricated. They haven't just added 1,000 years, they've fabricated the whole lot. But when you realise that the timelines are wrong, a lot of the stuff they say happened thousands and thousands of years ago didn't. It only happened hundreds of years ago. Everything begins to fall into place. Even the War of Napoleon and Alexander, there's no evidence that Napoleon was actually fighting Alexander. It would appear that Napoleon actually joined forces with Alexander, and they both marched on Moscow, which was a Tartarian city at the time. There's even a plaque you can find which has a bust of Alexander on one side and Napoleon on the other, with a Russian inscription that basically says there is strength in unity, or unity is strength, or something like that. It's in Russian. Why would that exist? And why would Napoleon have marched directly past St. Petersburg to attack Moscow when St. Petersburg was the capital of Russia, if he was really attacking Russia? Why did he march straight past Alexander's army without Alexander attacking him there at St. Petersburg? Because Alexander went with him, and they both attacked Moscow, and they just cooked up the whole story that it was a war between France and Russia, when it wasn't. It was both these generals marching on Tartaria. And it's even an interesting thing, the plaque of Moscow, the coat of arms of Moscow, the flag of Tartaria was a griffin. And there's the coat of arms of Moscow, if you look it up, it shows an Orthodox knight on a horse slaying a griffin. And this was around about 1780 or 1820 or something like that this coat of arms came into being. So they kind of tell you, they show you in their symbolism what really happened.
There's enough claims as it is about the Phoenician people traveling the world and reaching America, but we gotta understand that especially during the reign of Solomon, the Phoenician navy and the Israelite navy were one and the same. King Hiram of Tyre was very close with Solomon and his predecessor, King David. And the Bible speaks of him as an ally to the Israelites, especially in naval excursions, because that's what the Phoenician specialty was. The Bible also says that the Phoenicians and the Israelites intermarried, and the tribes of Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali all resided in Phoenician cities. These were the people that knew about the lands beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and of course Solomon, the wisest man to ever live, was made aware of this knowledge. The archaeological record shows the Phoenicians had colonies all throughout the Mediterranean, including Spain, Morocco, and Italy, and they traversed the entirety of Africa as well as reached into England and as far north as Scandinavia. We've also found ruins of them in the Azores and Canary Islands that could date back to this time period. They also had trade routes throughout Europe, the Sahara, and they utilized early versions of the Silk Road to trade with countries in the Far East like Babylon, the Zhou Dynasty China, and the region of Hindustan. That being said, the Phoenicians were a small and weak nation compared to the Israelites at this time. Solomon was the richest man on earth, and his exploits made the Phoenician cities extremely wealthy and powerful. He was the one who was said to originally fund their excursions and help them set up the colonies. But there's a weird story in the Bible that tells of a far-off land that's never been identified, where Solomon obtained the gold used to encase the temple, and an extremely fine mystery wood they called algum. The passage goes, "For the king had at sea a navy of Tarshish, with the navy of Hiram. Once in 3 years came the navy of Tarshish, bringing gold and silver, ivory and apes, and peacocks." And we have a story from early Spanish explorers in 1568 claiming to have found this land of gold, but evidence has never been found to back him up, although people have been searching. The Book of Kings says that the Israelite and the Phoenician navy sailed from the port of Ezion-Geber, a port in the Red Sea. So we know they traveled eastward, otherwise they would have left from a Mediterranean port. The journey was said to have taken 3 years, and they returned with billions of dollars in gold and the mysterious algum wood, which they said was used to build the temple pillars as well as creating extremely fine musical instruments. Also foreign spices and the peacocks, which has also been interpreted as parrots. Many theorize the land of Ophir referred to the people of India, which is very likely as it was a place filled with gold, spices, and of course peacocks. They would have most likely done their trading through the Silk Road, and the Babylonian merchants would have made products from India readily available to the Israelites and Phoenicians. They wouldn't necessarily need to take a 3-year journey just to trade. However, in Jewish tradition, Ophir is often associated with a place in India, named for one of the sons of Joktan, who was a descendant of Shem, one of the sons of Noah after the flood. Early explorers knew all of this, and they followed this trail all around the globe. A letter in the 1500s states that even Christopher Columbus thought he found the land of Ophir when he arrived in Hispaniola and saw the people adorned in gold. The explorers also thought to look to the west coast of North and South America. While South America is very rich in silver, it's not as plentiful in gold. But the native Peruvians claimed there were massive gold deposits to the land west of Peru. West of Peru is open ocean other than small islands until you reach Asia. But there is one other place in America that has been theorized to be Ophir, and it's California. Not only does California have an abundance of gold at this time, but it also is home to the largest trees on Earth, making for a great building material for God's temple. There's even an old gold mining town in California named Ophir, after the legendary source of Solomon's gold. And there does exist an old legend believed by early Spanish explorers like Hernan Cortez that a race of dark-skinned natives inhabited California going back thousands of years. If evidence of this were found, it would be likely to conclude that these people may have come from the Fertile Crescent, but there's no evidence other than the old stories told by conquistadors. These stories of Ophir and stories told by native Peruvians caught the ear of an explorer by the name of Álvaro de Mendaña de Niera. He's most famous for some of the earliest voyages across the Pacific in the late 1500s. This man claimed to have found this gold in the place he named the Solomon Islands, but countless searches have come up with no gold in this area, despite Álvaro's claims that he found the legendary source of Solomon's treasure. But the theories don't stop there. One document of interest found in the General Archives of Indies in Spain dating back to 1519 describes how to locate the land of Ophir. The navigational guide started from the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, went to India, to Burma, then to Sumatra, to the Molucca Islands, to Borneo, to Sulu, to China, and then finally to Ophir, which was said to be in the Philippines. Other theories also place Ophir in Malaysia, or Japan, or even Australia, which is not that far off from the Indian subcontinent. And if the Israelites and Phoenicians were in India, it's not a big jump to say they could have been in Australia as well. In fact, groups in India were said to have migrated to Australia about 1,000 years before the time of Solomon. One artifact that comes to mind is the aboriginal depiction of the Great Pyramids of Egypt, found in Australia. The knowledge of the pyramids could have been told to the Australian natives by the men of Solomon's navy. We also have certain artifacts that turn up in America pointing to a possible early Israelite or Phoenician voyage. The Newark Holy Stones, the golden tablets of the Book of Mormon, as well as interesting depictions in rock art, possibly showing Phoenician ships and Eastern symbolism. What we do know for sure is that during the reign of Solomon, the Israelites along with the Phoenicians traveled further than anybody in history until the 1500s. Even if the land of Ophir wasn't in the Americas, they still managed to sail as far as Southeast Asia, all the way around Africa, and as far north as England, which is an incredible feat for ancient people in their small trireme ships. Not even the later Romans, the Chinese treasure ships, or the Polynesian wayfinders made it as far as the Israelites and the Phoenicians. This was the first colonial empire, and they may have had colonies that we still don't know about today. And there's also nothing that could have stopped them from sailing to the Americas from either direction. Solomon was the wisest man to ever live. He created the first Tartarian building we have records of, and he must have been aware of an entire continent on the other side of the world.
Is it likely with the mud floods as well, Max, that we have the cyclical times of pole shifts? Is it likely that the cataclysm that caused it could have been a pole shift?
Well, it could have been. I mean, something that I talked about in my book was a slip of the crust on the lithosphere. There's a fluid layer below the crust, between the crust and the mantle. And if the ice caps got too heavy, with the axial wobble, you'd find that they'd slip and they'd relocate to the equator. And it happened in a matter of hours. So the poles would essentially stay the same, but the landmass on the top would slip, And that's something that I talked about in my book back in 2005. And there's also a document called The Adam and Eve Story that you might have seen that talks about exactly that scenario happening as well. But, I really speculate with the Earth and everything. I often speculate that the Earth is a lot bigger than what we're told, that there's land that we don't know about, which is why it's so difficult to find out who they are all the time. Figure out. But is there land that we don't know about, like the land that Admiral Byrd talked about? Is the Earth a lot bigger than what we're told? Are we simply existing in a crater? Are we simply like it's like we're living on the floor of a mine? Perhaps they just wash the mine out now and then as well. Who knows? You're getting into kind of highly esoteric areas, but I don't believe anything we're told about the Earth. I don't believe it's globe. I don't believe it's flat. I don't believe anything we're told about it. I think we're still figuring it out. So it's anybody's guess, brother, how it all happens. But yeah, I think it's very likely there are cyclic events that happen and that we're heading for another one. This is something else that I speculated with someone as well, is that if you look at the story of Noah's Ark before the flood, obviously Noah didn't go and collect 2 of all the animals and put them in a vessel to stop the flood. But he could have easily gone and collected the DNA of everybody and everything and stored that to survive the coming cataclysm, so then they could repopulate the world after that. I mean, is that what's going on as well? Just a question.
Yeah. What about Atlantis, though? Sorry, Chris. I'd like to ask you about Atlantis. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it definitely existed. It was definitely a place. It was a city. I think Atlantis was a worldwide culture. It was a city, which I believe is in, Mauritius, in northern Africa.
Yeah.
What they call the Rikat, that circular structure there in northern Africa, which is exactly where Atlantis would have been according to Ptolemy's maps and according to Plato's story. It was beyond the Pillars of Hercules. Yeah, I mean, that's where it is. And even if you look at the maps and the descriptions of Atlantis, it's all there in the Rikat. I think that was the city of Atlantis. I think that was the culture that existed after the first cataclysm, which I think wiped out Hyperborea, which was the culture before Atlantis. How do we know that the remnants of Hyperborea aren't still there beneath the ice on the South Polar Cap? How do we know? How do we know any of this sort of stuff? Is that why they're so scared of climate change and the planet heating back up to the temperate climate it should have? Because we shouldn't have any ice here. You know, it's been a lot warmer on this Earth previously. And are they so worried about that? Because if the South Polar ice cap were to melt, we'd see the remnants of the civilization that's left there beneath it. Just speculation again.
Yeah.